4 years after its initial PS4 release, Ghost of Tsushima from Sucker Punch Productions has been ported to PC by Nixxes software. What are the optimized settings like? What are PS5 settings, and how does the game perform? All that and more in this video looking at the PC port. But before I get into those things, let's talk about user experience and some odds and ends. As with every other Nixxes port of the PlayStation titles on PC, you're given a Nixxes-style graphical menu in this game where you can change options in real time to get a good sense of the visual and performance differences of changing said graphical options. This type of menu is always great to see, and I'm happy Nixxes are doing it again in this title here. I'm also very happy to see dynamic resolution being supported and the variety of upscalers, including FSR frame generation decoupled from FSR, albeit you don't get the FSR 3.1 spatial temporal upscaler that should be coming out in the future. The menu and options are generally great as it follows their proven design, but I think it could be slightly better, but more on that in a bit. In terms of the quality of the upscalers, we see the usual hierarchy, though DLSS has some issues in this title with depth of field as we see here. Basically, depth of field as seen behind characters here is abnormally jittery and aliased when using DLSS. With FSR, this does not happen at all. XeSS has a bit of instability, but on average, visibly less than DLSS. I'm not exactly sure what could be causing this, but it would be nice if it could be remedied for XeSS and DLSS over time with patching. Now, what about the user experience concerning fluidity and smoothness in this port? Here I have good and less than good things to talk about. The good is that the port does not have shader compilation stutter. Like other Nixxes games, there is a small pre-compilation burn when you start the game, and it appears to asynchronously compile them as well in the background as you're playing. So you will not see shader compilation spikes really while playing, and I don't think I saw any. Still, smoothness of the presentation is compromised in this port due to camera issues of some sort. Just spinning the camera in many of the game's scenes while holding down the stick on any controller will show that the camera can move inconsistently between frames, though the stick has been statically depressed. Either the camera has a jitter in it, or the game movement rate is uneven and not linear. Either way, I found it distracting while using the in-game VSync, and the game does not look smooth to my eye even when locked at a 60 FPS when panning the camera. This did not seem to happen on the PlayStation 5 version as far as I can tell, and it'll give Ghost of Tsushima on PC, in my experience, a less stable and less smooth appearance. I hope that can be looked at in future patches. Beyond this, there are some other artifacts that affect visual smoothness in this game from graphical issues, such as this weird flashing ghosted shadow as you can see here against the wall. I saw this multiple times through my playthrough, even after game restarts while playing the game maxed at 4K with DLAA. Another issue that happens with camera movement occurs with rapid disocclusions of geometry, which can lead to errors in the occlusion culling, and you'll get these kind of flashes on screen. Now, this also happens on PS5 as far as I can tell, but it being found to the same degree, even on the highest end settings, is slightly disappointing, as it is slightly distracting when it occurs. A last issue with smoothness I noted is a technical performance consideration depending upon your PC. Basically, the higher your PCIe bandwidth is, the more stable your frame times will be. As we can see on the left marked in blue, PCIe 3.0 when set to 8x has very poor frame time performance on camera turns, leading to a jerky look in motion. So if you have a GPU that is limited to 8 lanes and only supports PCIe 3.0 due to your motherboard, you will have to limit your game frame rate to 30 or 40 FPS to get a consistent experience in this game. Surprisingly, and somewhat also not great to see, is that even a full 16 lanes with PCI 3.0 will have a less than awesome frame time experience when the camera moves, as seen here when tested on the RTX 3070. Basically, look at the difference between the red, which is 3.0, and green, which is 4.0 on the frame time graph. It is plain as day to see that the higher PCIe bandwidth of 4.0 or green leads to a smoother frame time stability. With just 3.0's bandwidth at 16x, the 3070 will have rogue frame time variations going up to and above 18 milliseconds. This means unlocked frame rates using VRR with a PCIe 3.0 GPU could present as visually unsmooth, and if you're attempting a flat 60 FPS, you will see interruptions there. Now, usually I would never ever even talk about PCIe bandwidth at all in a multi-platform game review for DF, but it is a pattern that I've noticed from user reports and from my own background testing in PlayStation ports to PC. PCIe bandwidth is affecting frame time smoothness, and that's something that you will almost never see in a multi-platform game, which will design its systems differently from the ground up. A good example is Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, where frame time graphs of that game will show the exact same perturbations, lows and highs, no matter how much PCIe bandwidth you throw at it. According to developer presentations, we know that the Snowdrop engine used in Avatar wants to avoid PCIe transfers that affect performance. So multi-platform games like Avatar will not usually show PCIe bandwidth affecting frame times. And as a user, I generally prefer if CPU or GPU power are those things that affect frame times most, as they're eminently scalable, unlike PCIe transfer speed, which is more static, and it is an Achilles heel if overly stressed. And the biggest issue with PCIe bandwidth affecting frame times like this is that it's hard for average players to understand, I think. A good example of this obtuseness for average players from PCIe bandwidth limiting performance can be found when using an 8 or sometimes 10 GB GPU in these PlayStation ports. If you have an 8 GB GPU and incorrectly set resolution and texture resolution, you will sporadically have worse performance that would be hard for a user to diagnose as to why they are having sporadically worse performance. As you can see, when this scene loads here in this port, having the texture quality set to high at 4K on an 8 GB GPU makes the game utilize textures that are also in main system RAM across the PCIe bus. This then generally depresses performance, and in a pretty big way. This significant performance drop can just randomly occur after a new scene loads, or if you change a setting in the menu. A casual player might not understand that the reason they are seeing variable performance is due to heavy PCIe usage and the overflowing of VRAM. This is where I get back to the options menu and how it could be improved a bit, as I hinted before. I would really like if this depressed performance due to PCIe usage or VRAM overflow was made more transparent to the user in general in these ports in the options menu. I've seen this behavior of VRAM overflow ever since Spider-Man came out, and I think it would be great for users to be better informed about this behavior. Either these ports could use a VRAM meter, which we've seen in a lot of ports before, or they could use a texture quality setting that is automated based upon settings and hardware limits. Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, for example, does this. That game does not have a texture setting at all, and instead, the game handles texture quality for the user. It changes MIP streaming quality utilizing DX12 tiled resources in an automated way based upon GPU memory. So it'll only minimally degrade some textures if it needs to, and it importantly never allows the user to tank their performance or frame times due to PCIe transfers. I find that an interesting system. Either way, at the moment, Ghost of Tsushima has a lot of strengths that we see in other Nixxes ports, but it also has some issues at launch with smoothness and graphical artifacting.
I know your language, your traditions, your beliefs, which villages to tame and which to burn.
So how does PC up the quality over the PlayStation 5 version? As you're seeing in these cutscene comparisons here, two more obvious ones are image quality and frame rate. Cutscenes on PlayStation 5 are locked at 30 FPS and they can run at any frame rate on PC, thus dramatically increasing their smoothness at 60 and above. Not all elements of the game, though, have been upgraded to run at arbitrary frame rates, though, on PC. A number of the particle effects still run at low frame rates like they do on the PlayStation 5, like the dust along the ground here, or some other distant particle effects at times. At times, this can make the game look a little awkward, like in the opening cutscene, when the samurai charge down the hill, the particles arcing toward the beach are awkwardly low frame rate, even though they are taking up large parts of the screen. But that is a small concession overall, and you're getting a dramatic increase in fluidity in cutscenes here, which is greatly appreciated. Image quality is also a lot better in cutscenes and gameplay depending upon your PC rig. Since the PS5 version uses what appears to be SMAA 2TX, there is a constant ghosting that can occur that is most visible in cutscenes, with the previous frame being visible in the current one. The various image quality options on PC do not have this issue. But the biggest IQ win is due to the PlayStation 5 version using checkerboard rendering and outputting at 4K, which will have a constant pixelization on surface detail or edges even. If you use DLAA on PC or just any of the DLSS modes, for example, this will thoroughly fix that up and you'll have smooth edges with fine detail. That's pretty impressive, I think, here, considering how DLSS is running at half the real internal resolution versus checkerboarding in this comparison here. Unlike Horizon Forbidden West, Ghost of Tsushima thankfully upgrades other aspects of the visuals in meaningful ways. One of the biggest is in foliage draw, where on the PlayStation 5, foliage draws in pretty close to the camera, so you will often see barren hills in the distance as you walk forward. PC pushes that out much further, even just at the high setting, preventing pop-in and awkward Oblivion-like distant terrain detail. Based on the comparison with PC settings, the PS5 version has a custom setting for its foliage draw. It's lower than medium for distance, but the density is similar to high for those closer tufts of grass. So it's a custom setting on PS5. On PC, this setting for foliage draw is somewhat annoyingly handled by a generic LOD setting. This also affects opaque geometry LOD as well, and for those objects like we see here, PS5 lines up with the high setting, which is lacking the teapot and more detail in the mid-distance as seen on very high. Here I wish Nixxes instead had two options for LOD, one for foliage and one for opaque objects. Here for optimized settings, I recommend the high setting, which will prevent awkward draw in the mid-distance like we see on PS5, but it will also be less costly on the GPU in comparison to very high, which is only going to help the largest views in the game. Another good upgrade over PS5 is in shadow quality, where on PS5, shadows can turn quite mushy close to the camera with an obvious shadow cascade as we're seeing here in this house. On PC, you can push that up higher, and in side-by-side comparisons, the PS5 version has the same level of softness and aliasing as the high setting on PC, with very high and ultra going above. For mid-spec GPUs, I'll still recommend the high setting though to keep VRAM in check and save a bit of performance where possible. Screen space reflections are also upgraded on PC, as we can see here, with the softness and aliasing of the PlayStation 5 version being closest to the PC at high. Though due to checkerboarding, it is a blurrier resolve on PS5 than the DLSS we are seeing here on PC. The very high setting above that goes and resolves more detail with less fizzle. Still, I'll recommend that high setting on PC, as it will save 6% or more performance in a given scene while not losing a lot, I feel, on average. Here I would have really loved to have seen ray traced reflections added to this port to clean up things like water specifically and avoid SSR artifacting there. After these more obvious upgrades, I will say the visual improvements on PC become harder to spot. For example, the screen space shadows on PC on the very high setting have a more complete penumbra effect on them, where the high setting, which PS5 uses, resolves them in a more dithered way. Not a huge difference though, but it can cost a tiny bit, so I still recommend that high setting on PC instead of very high. Same story with volumetric quality. PS5 here is a closest match in softness and aliasing for the high setting, yet honestly, going above high will lead to crisper volumetrics, but they're not massively game-changing to the presentation. They cost a significant amount as well, with the high setting saving 6% over the ultra setting in a simple scene like this one, for what I would say is a small difference. So definitely use the high setting here. And this goes on. PS5 is essentially the high setting for other ones, and the high setting offers the best bang for buck in terms of performance. One area that I'm saddened to not see improved over PS5 is texture quality. Here, the game on PC will resolve the same texture quality as PS5 using the high or very high setting, which in my experience provide identical details in the game. This is somewhat of a shame, as I say, because the texture quality is the game's weakest aspect next to its insufficient indirect lighting. Many of the game's textures look kind of blurry, especially those for terrain. Another issue on PC is that the anisotropic filtering setting does not seem to meaningfully impact terrain texture quality at a distance, even when maxed out at 4K and 16x. So either AF is not working correctly or something else is happening. Either way, as mentioned at the beginning of the video, my texture quality recommendation for 8GB GPUs is to use high until you hit resolutions above 1440p. in which case you will need to go down to medium to make sure you don't see random performance drops. Another area of dubious upgrades versus the PlayStation 5 is ambient occlusion. Like other Nixxes ports, you can use other AO options here, like HBAO+, but the game's art does not seem to be designed around them, and they apply a more conservative AO to the environment. Here, I don't recommend using XeGTAO or HBAO+ for this game, as the visuals that you are getting are not necessarily aligning with the art in the game and the design there. Once again, I would have loved to have seen RTAO instead here. Combined, the optimized settings look like this, mainly high across the board, unsurprisingly not too far off from that PlayStation 5 version here. Here I would love to thank Mohammed, our DF contributor, for these optimized settings, as I was away on holiday when this game came out, and he stepped in to do a lot of the heavy groundwork here. So thank you kindly. With all the optimizations in place, we can see some grand performance wins in any given scene. Like here, a simple scene where optimized settings yield 33% better performance over Ultra settings on an RTX 2070 Super at 1440p native with DLAA. You can then further improve upon performance by using DRS or any of the scaling options, which I definitely recommend for any older or slower GPU. But that's really it. Coming to the end of this video here, I think we're looking at a generally competent port of this game on PC. I'm particularly fond of how it has meaningful upgrades in those key areas like foliage draw, which is definitely lacking on PlayStation 5. Otherwise, it has a lot of the Nixxes hallmarks, which will put it at the top of lists for port quality. I like the settings menu as always and those image quality options. Though, with this being their 5th port on PC since being acquired, I would not mind them to improve this great standard that they have established. I would like to see a different way to control texture and VRAM usage in these ports so that users have a better understanding of how their performance will be in-game, instead of just kind of guessing whether or not VRAM is overflowing or whether or not their PCIe bus is being hammered, either an automated system like we see in Avatar or a VRAM counter. That would be the next thing that would really take these ports to the next level. Like other Nixxes ports, there are of course a few noticeable issues in the version you'll have access to near launch. You can see some visual artifacting at times perhaps, and also there is a strange camera motion inconsistency that is occurring. I hope that that issue, as well as the depth of field issues I mentioned at the beginning of the video, can be fixed in patches. Performance-wise, beyond the heavy PCIe bus usage, I did not see anything that was too concerning here. It is a bit GPU heavy, I feel, for the visual return, especially on those ultra settings, though I imagine most people will be happy with how their GPU is performing when using optimized settings, which you definitely should use. Anyway, if you did like this video and found it helpful, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. Support us on Patreon to enable more work like this in the future, and of course write a comment below, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex, bin you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.